The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rugged town of Salt Creek. Its dusty streets, the veins of a place worn down by time and lawlessness. Jesse Walker rode his horse through the main street, his face shaded beneath the brim of his wide hat, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. His mind was elsewhere, far from the heat of the afternoon, far from the whispers of the past that had been chasing him for years. He'd been out of the game for months now, a quiet life in the middle of nowhere, the only thing that kept him going. No more killing, no more running, no more living in the shadow of men like Hank Coulter. But the Wild West never let a man leave so easily. Jesse had barely noticed the commotion until the gunfire rang out. The first shot shattered the afternoon silence like glass, followed by the sharp crack of another. A man fell in the street just ahead, his body crumpling in a cloud of dust. A crowd screamed, scattering in every direction like rabbits caught in a brush fire. Jesse's instincts kicked in before he could think, and he spurred his horse forward. It was a mistake, really, to get involved. The gunfight wasn't meant for him, but it was his to deal with now. He pulled his revolver, its cold steel familiar in his hand, and pushed his horse into the fray. His thoughts were singular: survive. He had done it before, 1,000 times, and he would do it again if it meant getting out of here alive. His body moved with the sharp, practiced precision of a man who had spent too many years in this life, but his heart, that had been locked away in a place he'd sworn to never revisit. A scream tore through the chaos, a woman's voice, high and desperate. Jesse's head snapped toward the sound. There, at the corner of the saloon, a woman stood frozen, her face pale with terror. Two men, their faces obscured by bandanas, approached her. One of them laughed as he raised his gun, aiming straight for her chest. Without thinking, Jesse was off his horse, his boots pounding the dirt as he sprinted toward the scene. His revolver flashed, a single shot that rang out sharp and true, the first outlaw falling with a gasp. But the second man was quicker. The gunman swung around, firing just as Jesse reached the woman. He felt a searing pain slice across his arm, but his shot didn't falter. The second man dropped like a sack of flour. For a moment, everything went still. The only sound was the ringing in Jesse's ears as he staggered forward, his legs weakening beneath him. His hand clutched his bleeding arm, but he didn't stop. Not yet. Get down, he shouted at the woman, his voice with adrenaline. She stood there, her wide, fearful eyes locked on him. He saw the way her hands shook, the way she pressed herself back against the wall, as if she could blend into it and disappear. Now, he growled, his voice taking on a rougher edge. This wasn't the time to question, to wonder. He was a man who acted before his brain caught up with the situation. The woman didn't move. Jesse was used to people being paralyzed by fear, but something in her eyes stopped him cold. She wasn't just scared, she was trapped. In one fluid motion, he reached out and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to the ground just as another shot rang out, grazing the corner of the building behind them. He shoved her into the dirt, keeping her head down. Stay low, he ordered, though it was more of a command than a suggestion. She nodded, though it was clear her thoughts were elsewhere. Her breaths were shallow, rapid. Jesse glanced around. The crowd had dispersed, but the danger wasn't over. They were still too exposed. Come on, he muttered, pulling her to her feet and hauling her toward the alley. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he cared enough to keep her alive, but there was something about her. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe it was the way she'd frozen in place, unable to protect herself, as though she didn't know how. Whatever it was, it kept him from walking away. He wasn't the hero type, not anymore, but something inside him rebelled against the idea of leaving her to die. The alley was dark and quiet, the sounds of gunfire still echoing in the distance. Jesse shoved the woman behind a stack of crates, pressing his back to the cold wood of the building. He winced, feeling the blood drip down his arm. He didn't have time to tend to it. The woman was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She had a thin, fragile look to her, sharp, intelligent eyes, and dark hair that had been pulled into a tight bun, strands already slipping free. She wasn't the typical damsel, though, that much Jesse could tell. Her eyes flickered to his wound, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. It was clear from the way she looked at him that she understood. He was the one keeping her alive now. She owed him, and Jesse wasn't sure he wanted to collect that debt, but the situation didn't give him the luxury of choice. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You need to get out of town. Go west, toward the river. It's your best chance." She met his gaze, a faint flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I can't," she said quietly. "My father," she stopped herself, biting her lip. Jesse narrowed his eyes. "What about your father?" "I don't have anyone else." The words came out in a rush, as though she was struggling to keep herself together. Her chin quivered slightly, but she didn't cry. She wasn't the type, not yet. Jesse exhaled sharply, his hand pressing harder against his wound as blood continued to seep through his fingers. "Fine," he said, his voice more gruff than he intended. "You're sticking with me, then?" "For now." The woman's eyes widened, but before she could protest, Jesse held up a hand. "Don't argue. We're better off together. If you want to survive, you stick close to me, understand?" She hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her options, then nodded. "You're lucky I was around," Jesse added, though there was no pride in his voice. His words were the simple truth. The Wild West wasn't a place for charity. The woman's gaze flickered to the street, the sounds of the gunfight slowly dying down, replaced by the quiet buzz of the town settling back into its ordinary chaos. But for her, nothing would ever be the same. "We'll need to get out of here before those men come looking for us," Jesse said, turning toward the alley's exit. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." And with that, he pulled her into motion again, away from the chaos of the town and into an uncertain future. What began as a chance encounter, a random act of heroism, would soon twist into something far more dangerous and far more complicated than either of them could have ever imagined. The days following the gunfight felt like a slow, grinding passage through a storm. Salt Creek, with its barren streets and the endless rustle of dry wind, seemed to wear down the edges of the soul. Jesse Walker had never been one to stay in one place long enough to feel the weight of time, but now it seemed to drag behind him like a shadow, no matter how far he tried to outrun it. He had taken Emily, the woman he'd saved, to a small cabin just outside of town, a place where no one would find them, where the noise of the outside world wouldn't reach them. It was rough, barely more than a shack, but it was safe, for the moment. The roof creaked in the wind, and the walls seemed to shudder with every gust, but it was a roof. It was shelter, and for that, Jessie was grateful. But Emily was not. She barely spoke as they settled into the cramped space. The fire in the corner crackled and hissed, casting long shadows on the walls, and Jessie sat, with his back to the door, his revolver resting within arm's reach. He watched her carefully. She hadn't said much since they arrived, her wide eyes constantly darting to the corners of the room, as though she expected someone to burst in at any moment. Jessie didn't blame her for being on edge. After all, she'd nearly died that afternoon, and he had dragged her out of the chaos without so much as a thank you. But he wasn't the type to indulge in pleasantries. His wounds were slow to heal, but it wasn't the bleeding that bothered him. It was the gnawing emptiness in his chest that seemed to grow every time he looked at her. She had her own demons, though, he could see it in the way she carried herself. Her shoulders were always hunched, like a woman who had learned to bear weight she shouldn't have had to. Her hands, though delicate and pale, were calloused from years of hard work. "Are you just going to stare at me all night, or are you going to say something?" Her voice was quiet, edged with something that might have been frustration or fear. Either way, it was a change from the silence. Jessie shrugged, not looking at her as he leaned back against the wall. "I don't have much to say." "You saved my life," she replied, her words heavy with the weight of that simple fact. "And you don't even want to talk about it." He met her gaze then, and for a moment, something flickered between them, an understanding, however brief, that neither of them was willing to articulate. But Jessie was a man of action, not words, and the silence between them deepened. "Doesn't matter now," he said, his voice low and harsh. "We're here. You're safe. That's all that counts." Emily scoffed, shaking her head, as she stood and moved to the window. She stared out into the darkened landscape beyond, where the barren hills stretched into the distance like a wasteland, empty and unforgiving. The wind whispered through the trees, a soft, mournful sound. "You think just being safe is enough?" she asked, her back still to him. "You think you can just save me, stick me in some cabin, and forget about everything that's happened?" "We're not just here to survive, Jessie. We're here because something went wrong. Because you're running from something. And so am I." He didn't answer at first, just watched her from his place by the fire. He hadn't expected her to open up, but there it was, the crack in her armor. For a moment, he considered pushing her back into her silence. She was a stranger, after all, a woman he barely knew. But something about the way she stood there, so broken and vulnerable, made him pause. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's the hand I've been dealt. You think I'm running from something? Hell, I'm not running from anything anymore. I'm just trying to stay alive." Her laugh was dry, bitter. "Stay alive by what?" "Hiding in the dirt, waiting for the world to come knocking." He didn't flinch at her words. "You got a better idea?" Emily turned then, her eyes blazing with something fierce and untamed. "Maybe I do. But I'm stuck here with you, aren't I? No way to get back to town. No way to escape whatever it is that's chasing us. You think you can just ride this out, Jessie, but there's more to it than that. The past doesn't let you forget, and neither do the people you've crossed." Jessie stood then, his muscles sore from the ride and the wounds that had yet to heal. He stepped closer to her, his face hardening as he narrowed the distance between them. "Don't start thinking you know me. You don't. And I don't know you." She didn't back down, her chin lifted defiantly, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I don't need to know you. I just need to survive. That's all I'm asking for. You say we are both here to stay alive, but you don't understand. I don't just need to survive anymore. I need something more." For a long moment, they stood there, inches apart. The tension between them was palpable, as if the weight of their own fears and desires was pressing in on both of them. Jesse's breath was shallow, his hand twitching toward his gun, not out of threat, but from an instinct that had been sharpened over the years. The quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp and sudden, a reminder that the outside world was never far away. Jesse's hand went to his gun in an instant, his body coiled like a spring. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Emily, his voice commanding. She nodded, her face pale, but she didn't argue. Jesse stepped to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Whoever was out there wasn't supposed to know about the cabin, not yet. But the knock came again, insistent, the sound of something dangerous lurking just beyond the threshold. He slowly pulled open the door, his gun at the ready. Standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness of the night, was a man Jesse had hoped never to see again. "Hank Coulter," Jesse muttered under his breath, the name tasting like bitter ashes on his tongue. Hank grinned, his smile cold and knowing. "Well, well. Looks like we've got ourselves a little reunion." Jesse's eyes flickered to Emily, who stood just behind him, her face stricken with a fear she hadn't shown before. The past had come knocking, and this time, it wasn't just Jesse who had to face it. "Looks like trouble's found us," Jesse said softly, the weight of his past and his future crashing down on him in that moment. Emily's heart raced, her body stiff with tension as Hank's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "You're not getting away that easy, Jesse." The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, rattling the door behind Jesse, but he didn't flinch. His gaze never left Hank Coulter's cold, calculating eyes. The man standing in front of him was a ghost from the past, a specter that had haunted Jesse's every move, every decision. He knew it wasn't a coincidence that Hank had shown up now. He'd been waiting, lurking, for the right moment to strike. Emily's breath caught behind him, a soft, barely audible sound, but Jesse heard it. He felt it like a stab to his gut, the realization that the danger wasn't just his to face anymore. She was caught in this, whether she liked it or not. "Get inside," Jesse ordered, his voice low but firm. His hand remained on the revolver tucked against his side, his finger brushing the trigger guard in a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't want to shoot Hank, not yet, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Every second stretched long, tight, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Hank stepped into the doorway without invitation, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, the creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence. "Always the stubborn one, Jesse," he said, his voice rough and smooth all at once, like gravel scraping against leather. "I thought you'd learn by now. There's no running from me." Jesse didn't back up. He didn't even shift. He just stood there, blocking the entrance with his body, as if he could stop the flood that was about to hit with sheer willpower alone. But even he knew that wasn't possible. "Leave, Hank," Jesse said, his voice colder now, edged with the years of bitterness that had settled deep in his bones. "This is between you and me. I'm not dragging anyone else into it." Hank's lips curled into a smile, slow and dangerous. "Oh, but you already have. She's a part of this now, whether you want it or not. You never could stay out of trouble, Jesse. Always dragging good folks into the mess you make." Jesse's heart thudded harder in his chest. He didn't want to think about Emily's involvement, didn't want to think about her getting caught in the web of his past. But Hank's words had a weight to them, a truth that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. It was too late to protect her. Emily stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear, her hands trembling ever so slightly at her sides. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice fragile but demanding, like she had the right to know now. And she did. She had every right. Jesse didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. How could he explain the man who had once been both a mentor and a nightmare? A man who had shaped Jesse into the cold, distant outlaw he'd become before tearing his life apart when Jesse had dared to try and walk away. Hank's gaze flickered over to Emily, then back to Jesse, his smirk widening. "She doesn't know. You didn't tell her. How predictable." His eyes glinted with malicious amusement as he took a step closer, forcing Jesse to shift just an inch. That was all Hank needed, just enough to remind him who held the power. "Jesse and I have history," Hank continued, his tone now casual, almost friendly. "History that stretches back to days neither of us are proud of. But you know, it's never too late to make things right. Is it, Jesse?" Jesse's jaw tightened, his muscles coiled with the old rage that Hank's words always sparked. This wasn't the man who'd saved his life. This was a reminder of everything Jesse had tried to outrun, tried to bury deep enough that no one could find it. But Hank had found it, like a vulture circling over a carcass, and now he was here to pick it clean. "You don't get to walk into my life and make demands, Hank," Jesse growled, every word a battle. Hank's laugh was a deep, rich sound, the kind that made Jesse's skin crawl. "Oh, I think I do. You've got a debt, Jesse. A debt you've been running from for a long time. You can hide out here all you want, but sooner or later, it catches up." Jesse's grip tightened on the revolver at his side, but his fingers stayed loose, controlled. He wouldn't let the fear take over. He wouldn't let Hank see it, because Hank always fed on fear. It was the one thing Jesse could never afford to show him. "I'm done with you, Hank," Jesse said, his voice deadly quiet. "I don't owe you anything." But Hank just smiled again, that same chilling, knowing smile. "You don't owe me anything. That's funny. I'm sure your old friends would disagree." The mention of friends hit Jesse like a fist to the gut. Old debts, old wounds. The men he'd once ridden with, men who had turned on him the moment the law started to breathe down their necks. Jesse had walked away, yes, but not without consequences. Emily stood frozen, taking in the exchange, her eyes darting between the two men. She was trying to piece it together, trying to understand the tension that crackled in the air, but she couldn't, not yet. The silence stretched longer this time, thick and suffocating, as Hank waited for Jesse to break. When Jesse didn't, Hank took a step back and let out a heavy sigh. "All right, Jesse," Hank said, his voice suddenly cold. "I'll make this simple. You come back with me, and you settle up your debt. You've been running long enough. Or you can stay here, hide away like a coward. But you know I won't let you hide forever. The past always finds you. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest. Hank was offering him a choice, but it wasn't really a choice, not in any meaningful way. Going back meant facing the men he had betrayed, and Hank would make sure of that. Staying here meant facing Hank's wrath, his men's vengeance. Either way, Jesse was caught in a trap of his own making. But as the wind howled louder, rattling the cabin's fragile walls, Jesse felt the weight of his decision settle in his chest. He couldn't outrun this, not anymore. He turned to Emily then, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the street, he felt the full weight of his responsibility toward her. She had no part in this, no part in his past, but she was here now, and she wasn't going anywhere. I'll go, Jesse said, his voice steady, though every part of him screamed to fight, to resist. But not for you. Hank's smirk faltered just for a second, but then it was back, that same smug confidence. Fine by me, Hank said, his tone a mockery of civility. But don't think you've got the upper hand, Jesse. You're already in too deep. Jesse didn't answer. He couldn't. The storm had finally broken, and all that was left was the mess it had made. Jesse's decision to face Hank had left him with a bitter taste in his mouth, but there was no turning back. The moment he stepped outside, the cold desert air bit into him, a reminder that nothing in this life was free. Not freedom, not safety, nothing. As he mounted his horse, Emily watched him from the doorway of the cabin, her face unreadable. She hadn't spoken since he'd made his choice, but the weight of her gaze lingered, as though she were seeing him for the first time, seeing the man who would choose to walk right into the storm instead of running from it. Hank stood a few paces ahead, his stance relaxed, almost too casual for someone who had just demanded another man's life be held in his hands. The wind tugged at his long coat, but he didn't flinch, the kind of man who'd made peace with his own darkness a long time ago. The two of them had been through too much together, too much blood spilled, too many friends lost, to believe there was anything simple about their encounter now. "We're headed to town," Hank said, his tone flat, but laced with that same dangerous amusement. "Better make sure you're ready. You might have to face more than just me before the day is done." Jesse didn't respond. He didn't need to. The town was where everything had started, where everything would end. He had known this day would come sooner or later, but the question that still gnawed at him was whether or not he would survive it. The debts he owed, the men he'd crossed, it all led back to Salt Creek, back to the people who had once trusted him and the people he had betrayed. As they rode in silence, the landscape around them seemed to stretch on forever. The dry, cracked earth underfoot seemed to echo the emptiness in Jesse's chest, a place that had once been filled with ideals and dreams, but was now hollowed out by the choices he'd made. He thought of Emily again, standing in the doorway, her expression so full of uncertainty. She had no place in this fight, no reason to be involved. Yet here she was, tangled in his past, and it felt like a weight he couldn't shake. The ride to town took longer than Jesse would have liked, each mile stretching out in front of him like a test of his resolve. Hank kept the distance between them at a comfortable length, not offering any further conversation, but Jesse could feel the tension building in the air. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the slow, creeping anticipation of violence. By the time they reached Salt Creek, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The town had changed since Jesse had last been there. Buildings that were once bustling with life now sat in silence, windows shattered, storefronts abandoned. The law had gotten to it, and so had the outlaws. There were fewer people walking the streets, and those who did moved quickly, keeping their heads down, as though the very presence of Jesse Walker brought a kind of curse with it. Hank dismounted without a word, his boots thudding against the dry earth. "The sheriff's office is up ahead," he said, glancing back at Jesse. "You're not walking out of this, Jesse. Not without answering for what you've done." Jesse followed him, his mind racing. He knew this game too well. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the power Hank had over the town. Hank had set things in motion long ago, and now he had all the pieces in place to bring Jesse down. And he wasn't going to let him leave without extracting every last ounce of satisfaction. They reached the sheriff's office, and Hank stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the doorframe. Jesse hesitated for just a moment before following. The building smelled of stale smoke and whiskey, a mix of old memories and newer sins. Inside, a few men sat at a table, cards spread out before them, their faces grim. They didn't look up as Jesse entered, but their eyes followed him, full of recognition, full of judgment. The sheriff was seated behind his desk, his face weathered and lined with the years. He had once been a man of honor, a man Jesse had respected, but that was a lifetime ago. Now, the sheriff's eyes only held suspicion, disdain. "Jesse Walker," the sheriff said, his voice low and bitter. "I thought I might see you again someday." "You don't need to worry about me, Sheriff," Jesse replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm here to settle my debts. Nothing more." Hank leaned against the wall, arms crossed, enjoying the scene. "Settle your debts? You think you can just waltz in here and make things right? You've been running from your past for far too long, Jesse. You think you can hide behind that good guy act?" Jesse's eyes flickered to Hank, then back to the sheriff. "I've got no excuse for what I've done, but I'll face it. It's time." The sheriff didn't respond right away. He just stared at Jesse as if weighing his words, considering the man standing before him. Finally, after a long silence, he stood up from his chair and moved to the front of the desk. "Did you think coming back here would make things right?" the sheriff asked, his voice rough, but with an edge of regret. "You've hurt a lot of good people, Jesse. And now you want to fix it. You think it's that simple?" Jesse swallowed hard, his throat tight with the years of guilt he'd buried so deep. "No. I don't think it's simple. But I'm done running." There was another long pause, and then the sheriff sighed. "You want redemption? It doesn't work like that, son. You can't just walk back into the world and expect it to forget everything you've done. Some debts, some things, you can't fix." Jesse's hands clenched into fists, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing on him harder than he expected. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. "I'm not asking for redemption," he said quietly. "I'm just asking for the chance to make it right." The sheriff seemed to consider this for a long moment before nodding, almost imperceptibly. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, as if everyone knew what was coming but no one was quite ready to face it. Hank, sensing that things were beginning to turn in Jesse's favor, pushed off from the wall and stepped forward. "This ain't over, Jesse," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you've paid your dues? You've barely scratched the surface." Before Jesse could respond, the door burst open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the small room. A few men entered, their eyes cold and hungry, like wolves closing in on their prey. The final confrontation had begun. In that instant, everything Jesse had been running from collided with everything he had hoped to escape. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every choice he had made, every life he had touched, and every person he had betrayed. There was no more hiding, no more running. As the first punch was thrown, Jesse realized that redemption wasn't something you could claim by just showing up. It was something you fought for. And for the first time in years, he felt the fire of that fight burn deep within him. The storm had broken, and now it was time to face the wreckage.